There's a berry that fed the indigenous peoples of North America for at least 10,000 years. It appears in the oral histories of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Blackfoot, the Lakota, and the Cherokee. In every case as a staple food rather than a supplementary one. It was dried in quantities sufficient to sustain communities through winters when nothing else was available. It was pounded with meat and fat to make pemmican, the concentrated food that enabled the long-distance travel across the northern plains, that European explorers later documented in journals filled with wonder at how far indigenous people could travel without resupply. Lewis and Clark ate it crossing the Rocky Mountains. They wrote about it in their journals with a specificity that tells you it was not a curiosity, but a provision. And by 1955, most of the families whose grandparents had known exactly which trees on which hillsides produced the best fruit, in which weeks of June, could no longer name the plant. Why? This is not a story about forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is gradual. Forgetfulness is uneven. What happened to the knowledge of the serviceberry that plant botanists call amelanchier was not forgetfulness. It was replacement. And replacement at this scale and at this speed has a mechanism. Before that mechanism becomes clear, it is necessary to understand what was actually being replaced, not just the fruit, the system that the fruit was part of. The serviceberry is not a single species. It is a genus of somewhere between 20 and 30 species, depending on which botanist you ask, distributed across North America from Alaska to Newfoundland in the north. From the Canadian prairies to the mountains of the American South, it grows in forest edges, on rocky hillsides, along stream banks, in the transition zones between woodland and open ground. It is among the first woody plants to bloom in spring, producing white flowers against bare branches, sometimes weeks before anything else in the landscape shows signs of life. In June, the flowers become berries, small and dark and ripening quickly over a window of 1 to 3 weeks, depending on location and year. Every indigenous nation that occupied territory within that range had a name for it, and a relationship to it that went beyond casual foraging. The Cree called it Missisquatomina. The Ojibwe called it Misquabimizi. The Lakota called it Wipazukan. The names are different because the nations were different, but the relationship was the same. This was food that was planned for. Families moved to be near productive stands at the right time of year. The location of individual trees was knowledge held and passed down. The timing of the harvest relative to bird behavior, to the color progression of the fruit from red to deep purple-blue, was knowledge refined over generations of observation. The dried berry was the key. Fresh serviceberries are sweet and good, but perishable. Dried serviceberries are transformed. The sugars concentrate. The texture becomes dense and slightly chewy. The flavor deepens into something richer and more complex than the fresh fruit suggests. And dried serviceberries, properly prepared, stored for months without refrigeration, they traveled in packs and pouches across country that had no supply infrastructure. They sustained labor that required sustained caloric input. They were mixed with dried meat and rendered fat in proportions that produced pemmican, a food so calorically dense and nutritionally complete that it sustained people through conditions under which imported provisions failed. The Hudson's Bay Company understood this. This is documented in the company's own records, which are among the most extensive commercial archives in North American history. The fur trade that reorganized the economic geography of North America in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries ran on pemmican. The company that dominated that trade purchased pemmican from indigenous producers in quantities that make clear this was an industrial supply relationship, not an occasional barter. The account books record the volumes, the correspondence between company factors at trading posts and the central administration in London discusses pemmican supply with the same urgency that a modern logistics company discusses supply chain disruption. The pemmican supply was not a convenience. It was a strategic necessity. The people who traveled the company's trade routes into territory that had no European resupply infrastructure for months at a time depended on food that would sustain heavy physical labor in cold conditions without spoiling in transit. The serviceberry was not peripheral to the pemmican supply. It was the carbohydrate fraction. It was the sweetness that made the dense fat and protein mixture palatable across months of field use. The specific preparation records, where they survive in ethnobotanical documentation of the Cree and Métis pemmican tradition, describe the serviceberry's contribution to the final product in terms that tell you this was not an improvisational ingredient. The ratio of dried berry to dried meat to rendered fat was knowledge. The quality of the dried berry, how it was selected, dried, stored, affected the quality of the finished provision. The people who produced pemmican for the Hudson's Bay Company were operating a food industry, and the serviceberry was one of its primary inputs. The Hudson's Bay Company was, without using the term or understanding the concept in the way a modern nutritionist would, sourcing a functional food ingredient at scale from the wild lands of the North American interior. The industrial food system that replaced this arrangement did not replace it with something nutritionally equivalent. It replaced it with a supply chain that was commercially tractable, geographically scalable, and compatible with the standardization requirements of mass retail. Stay with me, because what the nutritional science would eventually find when it examined this fruit is the part that the grocery industry had every financial reason to ensure you never connected to the history I just described. A review of research on Amelanchier alnifolia, the species most studied for its nutritional content, found anthocyanin concentrations comparable to or exceeding those of cultivated blueberries. Anthocyanins are the pigment compounds responsible for the health associations that have built a multi-billion-dollar blueberry industry. The research on serviceberry placed its antioxidant capacity at levels that matched or exceeded blueberry, strawberry, and raspberry in comparative studies. The iron content was documented as higher than the cultivated berries that replaced it in the commercial food supply. The fiber content was substantial. The vitamin C was present. The phosphorus, the magnesium, the folate were present. This is not a characterization of what the indigenous people who ate this fruit knew. They did not know the word anthocyanin. What they knew was the fruit, and they organized significant portions of their seasonal lives around its harvest. Communities did not relocate in June to harvest a plant that was nutritionally negligible. They relocated because the fruit was worth relocating for. The nutritional science arrived later to confirm what the practice had already demonstrated. Lewis and Clark crossed the Continental Divide in 1805, eating serviceberries at multiple points in their journals. Meriwether Lewis described the plant and the fruit with the botanical attention of someone who understood he was documenting something significant. For the scientific record he was building, the entries are not casual. They reference the fruit's appearance, its flavor, its preparation by the indigenous guides and communities the expedition encountered, its utility as a travel provision. The course of discovery was not foraging casually or desperately. They were provisioned in part by indigenous knowledge systems that had spent thousands of years optimizing which plants were worth carrying and how to carry them. The serviceberry was central to that provisioning. The journals that document this are primary sources held by the Library of Congress. They are not folklore. They are the field notes of a federal military expedition recording what kept them alive in terrain that no existing European supply chain could reach. The journals also document something that the standard historical account of the Lewis and Clark expedition tends to pass over. The expedition's survival on the Rocky Mountain crossing depended materially on knowledge and provisions sourced from the indigenous people they encountered. The Nez Perce, the Shoshone, the various nations whose territory the expedition crossed, sustained the Corps through the most dangerous portions of the journey. The serviceberry, dried, carried in pouches, combined with dried meat and the pemmican tradition that had sustained human travel across the northern plains for centuries, was part of that sustenance. The record of this dependency is in the journals. It is available to anyone who looks. What is not in the journals, what was not added by the historiography that followed, is the sustained acknowledgement that the food system that kept Lewis and Clark alive was the same food system that was progressively dismantled in the century that followed their expedition. The question that this history raises is specific. If this fruit fed indigenous nations across an entire continent for 10,000 years, if it provisioned the fur trade, if it sustained one of the most consequential expeditions in American history, if its nutritional profile is comparable to or exceeding the cultivated berries that now command premium prices in grocery stores, where did it go? Here is where the story stops being about a berry and starts being about a market. The grocery chain model that consolidated American food retail in the post-war period was built around standardization, centralized supply, and controlled inventory. A fruit that ripens in a narrow window in June, that does not ship well because it softens rapidly after harvest, that grows wild across the continent without requiring agricultural infrastructure, that cannot be contracted to a supplier because it belongs to no one, is not compatible with this model. It is not that anyone decided to suppress the serviceberry. No meeting was held. No memo was written. The fruit was simply structurally incompatible with the commercial food system that was being built. And the commercial food system that was being built was the only food distribution infrastructure that was expanding. The cultivated blueberry is, in this context, instructive. Blueberries require acidic, heavily amended soil to grow commercially. They require significant agricultural infrastructure. They require a grower, a picker, a processor, a shipper, a distributor, a retailer. Every point in that chain is a commercial transaction. Every transaction is revenue. A supply chain that long and that complex is not built around a fruit that anyone can pick from a wild tree in June for free. The grocery chains that consolidated American food retail between 1945 and 1965 did not say anything about serviceberries. They did not need to. They simply built systems around products that fit their model, and they marketed those products with the advertising budgets that the post-war consumer economy made available. The blueberry industry formalized and promoted from the 1920s onward, was exactly the kind of commercially tractable fruit that this system could be built around. By the time the serviceberry had been absent from mainstream food conversation for a generation, most Americans had no reference point from which to ask about it. The commercial reclassification of the serviceberry as an ornamental plant is the most specific evidence of what happened and when. This is documented in the records of municipal horticulture programs across North America from approximately the 1940s through the 1960s. Amelanchier species were systematically introduced into urban planting programs during this period as ornamental street trees. The reasoning given in horticultural literature was aesthetic. The early spring bloom was striking, appearing weeks before any competing flowering tree. The autumn color was consistent and reliably spectacular. The size was appropriate for street planting without creating conflict with overhead utilities. The species was adaptable to urban soil compaction, air pollution, and the particular stresses of a sidewalk environment, in ways that made it a practical choice for city arborists working under budget and maintenance constraints. All of this is accurate. The Amelanchier genuinely is an excellent ornamental tree. But notice what the horticultural literature of this period consistently omits: the fruit. The June harvest that the Ojibwe planned their seasonal calendar around, the dried berry that the Hudson's Bay Company provisioned its trade routes with, the provision that Lewis and Clark documented crossing the Rockies, the nutritional profile that subsequent research would find exceeded the cultivated berries filling grocery store shelves in the same cities that were planting Amelanchier on their streets. The institutional reclassification of this plant as ornamental required treating its most historically significant property as irrelevant. It required applying a category to the plant that excluded from that category the thing the plant had primarily been understood as providing for 10,000 years of human use in North America. The fruit was not mentioned in the specifications that went to city arborists. The planting guides that accompanied the introduction of Amelanchier into urban landscapes did not note the edible fruit. They described the flowers, the autumn color, the growth habit. This is not an oversight. Oversights are inconsistent. They appear in some documents and not others. What you find when you trace this institutional record across multiple cities, multiple decades, and multiple horticultural publications is consistent omission. The category of ornamental was applied cleanly. The category of food was not applied at all. The administrative record that shaped how city arborists understood this plant, and therefore how the generation of urban residents who grew up under these trees understood it, did not include the information that would have made the fruit visible as food. The generation that grew up in cities planted with Amelanchier street trees in the post-war decades grew up walking past a food source that was functionally invisible because the institutional language surrounding it had classified it as decoration. Their grandparents, in some cases, retained the knowledge. The knowledge was not systematically transmitted because the surrounding culture no longer provided the context that made transmission feel necessary. The grocery store was stocked. The commercial food system was producing abundance. That you were walking past a better version of that abundance on the way to the store was not a thought the culture supported. The Canadian prairie provinces are the exception that proves this pattern. Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba never fully completed the reclassification. The Saskatoon berry, Amelanchier alnifolia, maintained commercial cultivation in these provinces because the prairie Indigenous food tradition was close enough in time and in geography to the settler agricultural tradition that the knowledge of the fruit did not fully disappear from the farming community before being transmitted. Commercial Saskatoon berry orchards operate in these provinces today. The fruit is sold regionally in jams, wines, and dried berry products. Agricultural universities in Saskatchewan and Alberta have conducted decades of research into cultivar development and production agronomy. The knowledge infrastructure that the rest of North America lost survived in the northern prairies because the cultural disruption there was less complete. The research that has been done on serviceberry in the Canadian context produced named cultivars Thiessen, Northline, Smoky, Martin, selected for commercial productivity and flavor consistency. The agronomy is documented. The nutrition is characterized. The market is established at regional scale. This is not a fringe or alternative food system. It is a conventional agricultural industry built around a fruit that most Americans cannot name. What this means for the fruit that ripens in June on every Amelanchier street tree in every American city that planted them during the ornamental introduction programs of the mid-20th century is specific and recoverable. The fruit is there, the nutrition is there, the research is in the literature, the history is in the primary sources from Lewis and Clark back through the Hudson's Bay Company records, to the ethnobotanical documentation of indigenous food systems that predates European contact. The window is 1 to 2 weeks in June. The fruit is ripe when it moves from red to deep purple-blue, and when birds appear in the trees with sudden intensity, because birds track the ripeness with more precision than any human calendar. A ripe serviceberry tastes like a blueberry that has been crossed with a mild almond, with a complexity that the cultivated blueberry, selected over generations for size and shipping durability, has largely lost. The iron content is higher than the blueberry you paid $8 for at the grocery store. The anthocyanin content is comparable. The tree it came from was planted by a municipal government as street furniture. The knowledge was not lost, it was reclassified. The fruit was not made unavailable, it was made invisible. The system that made it invisible was not designed to suppress this specific fruit. It was designed to sell specific other fruits, and this one did not fit the design. The berry that fed a continent for 10,000 years, that provisioned the fur trade, that kept the cores of discovery alive crossing the continental divide, is ripening on city street trees right now and falling on the pavement beneath them. The family whose grandparents knew which trees produced the best fruit on which hillsides in which weeks of June has been replaced by a family that drives to the grocery store and pays $8 for a pint of blueberries with lower iron content. That is not progress. That is a replacement. A replacement that was made by someone for reasons with financial consequences that were not distributed equally between the people who made the choice and the people who lost the knowledge, and understanding who made it and why and what it cost the people who did not make it is exactly the kind of history that the dominant institutions of the food industry have a structural interest in not telling. If you found this genuinely useful, watch the next video and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.